Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us today for this eighth installment of Suburban Diagnostics Knowledge 3 series of webinars, where today we have lined up two sessions to provide insights into the clinical approach and the diagnostic aspects of renal disease. My name is Dr. Vineet Nair, and I'll be a moderator for today's event. I'd like to remind everyone that our webinars are intended to be as interactive as possible, and we encourage you to actively participate by submitting as many questions as you like at any time you want during the presentation. To submit your question, simply type the question into the chat box to your right and click send. We will have a consolidated Q&A session with both speakers towards the end of the presentation. If you have any trouble seeing or hearing the presentation, please use the chat box to let us know that you're experiencing a problem. Please note, with this webinar, we'll be giving certificates of attendance. All those who complete the webinars and wish to be provided with the certificate must fill a form which we will provide to you at the end of the webinars. This form will only ask you for your email as well as your name and title as you want it to appear on your certificate. I would now like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Arun Shah. Dr. Arun Shah is a renowned consultant in nephrology in Mumbai with a cumulative experience of 32 years. He has done around 120 transplants and was awarded as the best clinician and academician in nephrology on the Doctor's Day by IMA in 2013. He is the vice president of Mumbai Kidney Foundation and has various national and international papers and publications to his accolades. Without further ado, let me hand over the reins of this webinar to Dr. Shah. Over to you, sir.
Good afternoon. At the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Sanjay Arora, the chairman of Suburban Diagnostics, for arranging this educational webinars. I also thank our moderator, Dr. Vineet Nair, my co-speaker, Dr. Ritika Agrawal, and the coordinator at the back office, Dr. Maria and Mr. Sarfaraz. They have been instrumental in setting up this webinar. Now, today's talk will be on clinical syndromes in kidney disease and pertaining investigations. Now, all of us know that patients with kidney disease may have a variety of different clinical presentations. Some have symptoms directly referable to the kidney, like hematuria or loin pain, or to some extrarenal symptoms like edema, hypertension, or uremia. Many patients are asymptomatic and they are detected to have renal disease on serum creatinine and abnormal urinary investigations. Most useful information is obtained by symptoms of the patient, physical examination, and urine analysis, CBC, biochemistry like renal profile, and estimation of GFR. So we will see in detail as per each syndrome what investigations are important in that syndrome. Kidney function. So all of us know that kidney maintains extracellular environment. It removes waste products of metabolism like urea, creatinine, and uric acid, and it adjusts urinary excretion of water and electrolytes. Kidney helps you to maintain your sodium, potassium, chloride, phosphorus, calcium, and it helps in reabsorption of these elements and excretion. And kidney also secretes hormones that regulate systemic and renal hemodynamics like renin, prostaglandin, bradykardin. It also produces erythropoietin, which is helpful in RBC production, and it also produces dihydroxyvitamin D3, which is helpful in calcium, phosphorus, and bone metabolism. After this brief introduction about the kidney disease, let us come to the first slide. Now, this first slide is the cornerstone of our talk today. So this will appear at the beginning and at the end. All renal nephrology students, when they enter their first year and they start facing the kidney patients, they are always asked, which is the clinical picture? Then they have to look at where is the problem and which syndromes are associated with it. So if once they learn this, it becomes easier for them to assess exactly how to investigate this patient and how to work up this patient. Now,
Excuse me, sir. We are getting some feedback that your audio is a little low. Can you speak a little louder?
Yeah, I will just bring it closer. Now, a patient, when he presents to a practicing doctor, if he has a good urine output, almost normal blood pressure, he has a urinary abnormalities like some small proteinuria, small RBCs, small blood pressure, then you know the disease is probably in the tubules and interstitium. As all of you know, there are four main structures in the kidney where, when they are affected, that causes the renal syndrome. The first and foremost is tubules and interstitium, then the vessels in the kidney, then the glomerulus. Glomerulus is the main structure which all of us know, but that is not the only organ affected in kidney disease. It is all three, tubules, vessels, and glomerulus, which is affected and which produces the renal syndrome. Now, what happens in tubular damage? Whenever there is ischemia to the kidney, whenever there is infection, when some drugs are given, when there is some pigment load like myoglobulin or hemoglobinuria, when there is obstruction due to crystals or monoclonal gammopathies, then you will get tubular damage. Interstitial damage you will get because of the drugs, infection, lupus nephritis, sarcoidosis, lymphomas, IgG nephropathies, you will get interstitium affected. In transplant rejection also, there will be interstitial fibrosis. In the vessels of the kidney, there are small vessels which can be affected because of the kidney transplant. There can be thrombotic microangiopathy. There can be large vessel affected which can cause renal syndrome, is cholesterol emboli following any procedures, and then polyarthritis nodosa, all of us know, can cause hypertension and kidney disease. Pregnancy-related vascular damage and TTP, health syndrome, atypical HUS, all these things will happen with the vessels of the kidney. And in the glomerulus, you will have either the nephritic syndrome or the nephrotic syndrome. Any patient who presents with decreased urine output, hematuria, proteinuria, raised blood pressure, edema, and increase in urea and creatinine is a presentation of nephritic syndrome. And that is, the disease is in the glomerulus. While the patients who have got only large proteinuria with no blood pressure, otherwise happy looking patient, the mother says the child has put on weight, where when you do a urine test, there will be large amount of proteinuria, but no RBCs. And when you do renal function biochemistry, creatinine is normal. So these are the patients of nephrotic syndrome, where they are losing large amount of proteins in the urine. Sometimes either a nephritic syndrome or a nephrotic syndrome can present with acute kidney failure with rise in urea creatinine, and they could be causes of AKI different than the primary glomerular disease. So we have to tackle this patient as and how they present to us. Now, let us enumerate the syndromes in nephrology. When we talk about any patient's kidney disease, we talk in terms of either acute nephritic syndrome, nephrotic syndrome, isolated urinary abnormalities, acute kidney injury, chronic kidney injury, urinary tract infection, renal tubular disorders, hypertension, urinary tract obstruction, and urolithiasis. So this is the group under which we divide our patients and label them at the initial meeting when they come to us. In this, what we have missed out, there are two things like genetic diseases of kidney, but they will come with either the renal tubular disorders or urinary tract obstruction, and another is malignancy. Normally, we take these syndromes with in urological practice, so I have not included here. Now, what are the investigations you do in kidney disease? The baseline investigation in any patient who comes with kidney disease is urine routine. The important thing to learn in urine routine, the kidney disease starts when urine albumin or protein is stressed. So if a patient at 3 different readings at 1 month interval, urine protein is at rest, then this patient is in trouble. If there are some RBCs in the urine, then he has got kidney disease. Any cast cell, whether it is WBC or RBC cast, then they are in trouble. Then in infections, you have to do urine culture, a clean catch culture, 24 hours urine protein or sport protein creatinine ratio is very important in all the patients who are losing proteins in the urine. Your analysis for stone disease, patients who recurrently form stones, you have to do 24 hours urinary calcium, 24 hours urinary uric acid, oxalate and citrate. Then in multiple myeloma, you have to urine Pan's protein, urine electrophoretic pattern, and urine immunofixation. So in kidney disease, urine routine is not the only urinary investigation. There are a variety of urinary investigation we may need to do and interpret them correctly to go on to further investigation. In the blood, we do CBC, kidney profile, fasting blood sugars, lipid profile. We do immunological studies like ANA, anti-dsDNA. We do complement studies, C3, C4 complement. To rule out vasculitis, we do CNCA and PNCA. To rule out glomerular basement membrane disease, we do anti-GBM antibodies, anti-phospholipid antibodies. So various immunological workup studies we do. And if there is acid-base disease because of tubular dysfunction, we may have to do blood gas and other investigations. Imaging, we do sonography, CT, and MRI. Depending upon creatinine, we may use contrast or we may not use contrast. In MRI, up to creatinine of 2.5, contrast is fairly safe, so you can use the contrast and do the MRI of the patient. Once we have established that this patient has persistent proteinuria or hematuria causing hypertension and drop in GFR, then to label the diagnosis, final diagnosis, if kidney size is normal, we may need to do kidney biopsy. Dr. Ratika Agrawal will take us in detail about kidney biopsy. Now, what are the genetic testing in kidney diseases? Any patient who has got a very strong family history of kidney disease, like ADPKD or ADTKD or congenital obstructive uropathies or EPOC, the African Americans, Black Americans, they have got all kinds of nephropathies which are very common. Then FSGS, primary FSGS, then some membranous diseases, then steroid responsive nephrotic syndrome, thrombotic microangiopathies, C3 glomerulopathies. All these patients, you need to do genetic studies. And these are available at certain centers in Europe and USA. And this may help to tell the family about the prognosis of the patient and how to take care of other family members. In renal tubular disorders, when there are some persistent electrolyte disorders or primary Fanconi syndrome, when there is difficult diabetic insipidus, you have to study the genetics of this patient and you have to do specialized tests. Now let us say different syndromes. Acute nephritic syndrome is present. It presents with edema, hypertension, oliguria, and azotemia. Urine will show RBCs, RBC cast, WBCs. Proteinuria may or may not be nephrotic range. Normally, it is subnephrotic proteinuria. Patient has got hypertension, rapidly declining renal function. You have to do immunological workup, and if kidney size is normal, do the kidney biopsy. So any patient with hypertension, hematuria, rising urea creatinine, and acute onset is acute nephrotic syndrome. Now, the same patient, when presents with large proteinuria, we call as nephritic presentation of nephrotic syndrome. The pure nephrotic syndrome patient will present to you with pedal edema, facial puffiness, ascites, and anasarca. When you do a urine test, there will be nephrotic range proteinuria, which will be more than 3.5 grams per day. There will be fatty particles. Occasionally, you get RBCs. Blood pressure may be normal. Blood investigations will show low albumin, increased cholesterol, and BUN creatinine will be normal. Kidney size will be normal, maybe slightly increased in large nephrotic syndromes. In children about 10 years and below 2 years, we do the biopsy between 2 to 10, we consider as minimal change. And all the adults with nephrotic syndrome, we do the kidney biopsy to finally pinpoint the disease process. Now, there are sometimes just in medical checkup, patients have no complaints, no blood pressure, no diabetes, and they are asymptomatic. But urine repeatedly shows small proteinuria or hematuria or WBCs in the urine. Biochemistry is normal, imaging is normal. Now, these patients usually they are observed over a period of time. If they develop hypertension or more proteinuria or more hematuria, then they are taken up for biopsy to rule out IgA nephropathy. Now, acute kidney injury, by definition, any patient who has an increase in serum creatinine of more than 0.3 milligram in 48 hours, or creatinine increases 1.5 times from baseline within 7 days, and it is called as acute kidney injury. Now, there is second element to is a urine output. So, in our indoor patients, we also go by urine output criteria. If urine output is less than 0.5 ml per kg per hour for 6 hours, then we say that patient has acute kidney injury, and we ask our residents to act very aggressively in this patient. Now, clinical presentation depends upon cause, whether it is pre-renal, renal, or post-renal, and whether patient is in fluid overload, whether he has got edema, hypertension, or dyspnea. Urine may be bland, it may show granular cast, it may show hematuria, it may show uric acid crystals. So depending upon the primary pathology, it will show you different urinary picture. Biochemistry may show rising urea and creatinine, electrolyte abnormalities, and acidosis. Imaging will give you an idea about size of the kidney, whether there is obstruction, normal size kidneys, or underlying CKD. If patient is anuric or oligoanuric, if kidney size is normal, and if creatinine is not coming down, then we advise biopsy of these patients. Chronic kidney disease. Chronic kidney disease is defined as abnormal kidney function or structure lasting more than 3 months with associated health implications. Sometimes patient can be asymptomatic. So 80% of CKD patients are asymptomatic till this age stage 4 or 5 of CKD. They can come with fluid overload or weight loss. Urine will show different pictures like proteinuria, RBC, scars, low specific gravity. Biochemistry will show anemia. It will show acidosis, hypocalcemia, raised phosphorus, raised PTH levels, low vitamin D, and raised BUN creatinine. And the hallmark of chronic kidney disease is small size kidneys. There are few exceptions to this rule. Like in diabetic chronic kidney disease, the kidney size may be normal, and adult polycystic kidney disease with CKD, the kidney size may be normal or large. Now, if patient has normal size kidney and there is no other cause for CKD, one may do the kidney biopsy to evaluate the cause. Urinary tract infections. Now, this is self-explaining. Patient may present with fever or lower urinary tract symptoms like dysuria, urgency, frequency, and suprapubic pain. There will be RBCs and WBCs in the urine and WBC cast. The biochemistry will show raised leukocytes, raised CRP, PCT, and rising urea creatinine. The imaging would be very important to see whether there is any stone obstruction, any calicial necrosis and causing obstruction, abscesses, and any surgical treatment to be offered or not. And in biopsy, you may have to do if you're suspecting some chronic diseases or tuberculosis. Renal tubular disorders are difficult in clinical practice to find out, but patients who come with polyuria and repeated nocturias and fractures due to metabolic bone disease. Urine may be practically normal, except there may be small proteinuria, occasional hematuria. Biochemistry may or may not show azotemia, anemia, acidosis. Kidneys will be normal or large size or normal size, and biopsy will show you the renal tubular fibrosis or atrophy. Urinary tract obstruction mainly will come with abdominal pain, retention of urine, vomiting, and fever. The main investigation would be by imaging, sonography, CT, or MRI will clinch the diagnosis. Sometimes when you do CT and MRI, you may find retroperitoneal fibrosis. And so a cause of urinary tract obstruction will be essential to find out with imaging studies. Stone disease, again, patients with recurrent stone will come with fever, pain, hematuria, urine will show RBCs, WBCs, biochemistry may show some blood, WBCs, creatinine may or may not go up. Imaging will show you stone. So sonography is the hallmark of the investigation, but you may need to do CT and MRI to rule out infection and obstruction, and biopsy is not indicated. But sometimes in recurrent stone formers, you have to do 24 hours urinary calcium, oxalate, uric acid, and citrate level to treat them for metabolic problems. So this is a table in nutshell about all the urinary syndromes which I have described and what are the main manifestation of this each syndrome and main investigation, the salient investigation part of urinary syndrome. And going back to the first slide, after giving you this brief of renal syndromes, a nephrology student first year should start thinking when a patient comes to him, okay, where is the problem? Are we looking at the problem in tubules, interstitium, or vessels, or glomerulus? Over a period of time, in their 3 years of training, depending upon presentation of the patient, they start getting idea, gathering knowledge. Okay, this patient could have just tubules and interstitial disease. This patient will have vessel disease. This patient will have glomerulus disease. And that will lead them to proper investigation to find out what syndrome predominates. And ultimately, they may end up with kidney biopsy, which will take them to the final diagnosis of the patient, which might help in further treatment of the patient. Thank you. I would like to have questions at the end of second session. And now I invite Dr. Ratika Agrawal to take us through various kidney pathologies. Over to Dr. Vinit.
Thank you, sir, for that illuminating presentation. Let me remind the audience that we will be, as sir said, that we will be answering your questions for both sessions together at the end. For those attendees who came in late, let me reiterate that with this webinar, we will be giving certificates of attendance. All those who complete attending the webinar and wish to have the certificate must fill a form which we will provide to you towards the end of this presentation. Let me now introduce our second speaker, Dr. Ratika Agrawal. She has a rich experience of handling anatomic pathology cases for the past 15 years. Her core areas of expertise are nephropathology, uropathology, gastrointestinal pathology, and oncopathology. She also holds a PDCC in renal pathology from the Sanjay Gandhi Postgraduate Institute of Medical Sciences, which makes her an expert in the interpretation of native and transplant renal biopsies, direct immunofluorescence, and electron microscopy. Over to you, Dr. Ritika.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Vineet. And thank you, Dr. Arun Shah, for a very enlightening and in-depth talk on nephrology. So, good afternoon, friends and colleagues. My talk is mainly with the role of renal biopsy in medical renal disease. I shall not be dealing with the surgical aspect of it, as in I will not be talking about tumors. And owing to time restrictions, I shall only discuss the aspects in native kidney disease. So the renal biopsy is performed usually by the nephrologist or by the radiologist using a biopsy gun, and this is done under imaging guidance. The recommended needle size is 14 or 16 gauge needles for adults and 16 or 18 gauge needles for children. It is better to not use needles which are any thinner than this, because otherwise it leads to artifacts in the biopsy. Like this is a biopsy done by a 16 gauge needle, and this is a biopsy done by a 19 gauge needle, where there is a lot of tearing in the biopsy and glomeruli are detached, which compromises the diagnosis. So the aim of the renal biopsy is to provide an accurate diagnosis, and for that, the tests which are required include, of course, light microscopy, and then immunostaining techniques, including DIF and sometimes immunohistochemistry, and transmission electron microscopy. Now, biopsy has to be collected separately, usually for LM and IF. The EM biopsy, better to collect it separately, but the light microscopic tissue, which is paraffin embedded, can also be used for EM. Separation for each of these techniques is best done at the time of the biopsy, and in intra-institutional setups, it is done by the nephrologist. This is how the core would look under a dissecting microscope. These are the glomeruli, these bloody spots that we can see in the biopsy. And this is the medulla, where there are parallel running vasa recta and medullary rays. This is the this is the division that should be followed while dividing the core for all the three techniques. The larger part of the core is kept for light microscopy. The two ends are submitted for electron microscopy, and the smaller part of the core is kept for immunofluorescence. There are certain specific fixators which are used for each of the tissues. For light microscopy, tissue must be fixed in 10% buffered aqueous formaldehyde or formalin. For immunofluorescence, it is transported in the Michel medium, where it is stable for up to 1 week at room temperature, or we can even send it in ice cold normal saline, provided we maintain the cold chain till the sample has reached the laboratory. For EM, tissue must be sent in 1 to 3% glutaraldehyde or 1 to 4% paraformaldehyde, that is ice cold. This is how the sectioning of the renal biopsy is done, because we must always keep in mind that the glomerulus is a structure and we need to evaluate it fully. The stains that are performed are HNE, PS, MT, silver, methenamine silver, and Congo red. Very thin serial sections are taken, 2 to 3 microns. And each slide has to be labeled in the succession that which sections are taken, so that we know which level we are looking at. There are 4 special stains which are routinely required in the renal biopsy: the PAS stain, the Mason's trichrome stain, the silver methenamine stain, and the Congo red stain in cases where it is required. Each stain highlights certain specific components of the renal biopsy. The PAS stain highlights basement membranes. It will will delineate deposits such as protein, hyaline, fibrin, collagen, amyloid, and light chain carbs. Both positive and negative staining has its own importance. And then, of course, fungus. The Mason's trichrome stain will stain fibrin, collagen, and immune deposits. The colors are blue and red that it gives, and they have to be interpreted accordingly. The silver methenamine stain will again delineate the basement membrane abnormalities, and it will stain the mesangium. And depending on whether it's argyrophilic or non-argyrophilic, has its own diagnostic implications. So when we start looking at the renal biopsy, please remember that the biopsy has been sent to the pathologist for a specific diagnosis, more often to exclude the various clinical differential diagnoses. The most important thing which we need to assess in the biopsy is the degree of chronicity, so as to be able to prognosticate, and we are there to help the clinician in making therapeutic and management decisions. These have already been discussed in depth by Dr. Shah, and I will not discuss them again here. I will straight away talk about the approach to reporting a renal biopsy. Whenever we start looking at the biopsy, we need to divide the histology into 4 compartments. These are the glomerular compartment. The tubular and interstitial compartments are usually considered together because they are intimately related. And then the vascular compartment, which comprises the arteries and arterioles. We must remember that all 4 compartments are interdependent and they function as a single unit, and any changes that occur in one is bound to affect the others later. So the role of the pathologist here is to identify the primary focus of injury in the biopsy and define what are the secondary changes that have happened. It is better to follow an algorithmic evaluation, which begins with the low power examination of the biopsy core. One has to see for cortex and medulla. We have to count the number of glomeruli present in the sample, the percentage of globally sclerosed glomeruli, then look at the tubulointerstitium and see for inflammation, what is the type of inflammation present, how much is the scarring present in the biopsy, where is the inflammation present, whether it's in scarred areas or in unscarred areas, and the vascular changes. What is the adequate number of glomeruli in a biopsy? Now, various studies have taken 10 as the minimum required number for an optimal diagnosis. For certain diseases, even 1 glomerulus may be enough, such as for the membranous nephropathy or amyloid deposits. This would depend upon the frequency of involvement of the glomerulus by the renal disease. If it is a disease which is diffusely involving the glomerulus, then even 1 or 2 glomeruli would be sufficient. While if it is a very focal disease such as FSGS, we may not be able to detect the disease even if we have 50 glomeruli in the biopsy. The number of glomeruli sampled also represents the amount of cortex which has been sampled. And so if we have a small number of glomeruli, the amount of cortex we are looking at is very less. And in that case, the diagnosis that may not be representative. Again, whenever we see a globally sclerosed glomerulus in the biopsy, is it always pathological? No, because there is age-related glomerulosclerosis which happens in the biopsy. And in a study by Walter et al., they have defined the upper limit of normal number of globally sclerosed glomeruli that one may find according to age. So for those who are interested, can go to this article published in NDT. It's in the December 2015 issue. It gives us the number where we would identify the normal physiological number of globally sclerosed glomeruli in the biopsy. Coming to normal renal histopathology. This is a diagram of the gross appearance of the kidney with the cortex, the medulla, the renal vein and artery, and the pelvic ileal system. I'm sorry, can't see the slide. Okay, so this is the structure of the normal glomerulus. This is a schematic diagram showing the capillary lumens. This is how they look like under the microscope. These are the patent capillary lumens. This pink area which is supporting these capillaries is the mesangium, and this is surrounded by a capsule which is the Bowman's capsule. This empty looking space here is the Bowman's space or the urinary space. This is what the Mason's trichrome stain looks like, where the mesangium is stained blue and the nucleus is red. This is the lobular architecture of the glomerulus. This is the higher power view, will beautifully delineate the capillary lumens. These are the mesangial cells which are present in the mesangial area here. This is the matrix. The blue staining is of the matrix. These are the parietal epithelial cells. And these cells which are sitting on top of the capillaries are actually the podocytes. These are RBCs present within the capillary lumens. Again, a higher power view of the same, showing various cells. This is the podocyte, the parietal epithelial cell. This is the endothelial cell here. And these are the mesangial cells. We can see that the basement membranes or the capillary walls are really smooth and they do not show any abnormality or thickening. This is a slide depicting a normal histomorphology of the tubules. These are the proximal tubules where the cells are large. They have abundant granular eosinophilic cytoplasm because of the presence of mitochondria. These are the distal tubules with smaller cells, which are cuboidal. Again, the proximal tubules, the PAS stain, which is highlighting the tubular brush border epithelium in the proximal tubules. This is absent in the distal tubules. This is a silver stain, which highlights the tubular basement membranes. And this is the Mason trichrome stain, which stains the protein droplets in the proximal. Very often we see these protein droplets even in the normal kidney. These are protein resorption droplets. This is the medullary interstitium and this is the cortical interstitium with the peritubular capillaries. The cortical interstitium is non-existent almost in the normal biopsy. Here it's a little more in the medulla. This is the interstitial collagen, a vessel wall and a nerve bundle, which are stained blue with Mason's trichrome stain. The largest blood vessel that we see in the renal biopsy is the arcuate artery, which travels in the fibrous stroma that is present between the cortex and the medulla. So if you have an arcuate artery with the cortex and the medulla, you know you've sampled the corticomedullary junction. Sampling of the corticomedullary junction or the juxtamedullary cortex is important in certain diseases such as earliest lesions would occur in the juxtamedullary cortex. This is a picture which shows arterioles and this is an artery. Arterioles will usually have 1 to 3 muscle layers in their wall. A Mason's trichrome stain which highlights the internal elastic lamina of an arteriole. This is an afferent arteriole. As we can see, this is a glomerulus and this arteriole is almost continuing into the glomerulus. This is the afferent arteriole. It's very difficult to distinguish between afferent and efferent arterioles in the biopsy if they are not both present together. Coming to the patterns of glomerular lesions that we see in the biopsy. So when we are looking at the glomerulus, we need to evaluate it for presence of hypercellularity, and we need to identify where that hypercellularity is, whether it's in the mesangium, whether it's inside the capillaries, or whether it is extracapillary, that is in the Bowman space. Then we need to look at the capillary loops, whether they are patent or they are collapsed, or whether they are occluded by presence of cells or fibrin. Then look at the capillary wall or the GBM, look at the thickness, the contours of it, whether it is smooth or whether there are any spikes or irregularities present, whether there are any double contouring of the GBM, and of course we need to evaluate it for deposits. The mesangium needs to be looked at for presence of deposits and for, of course, increased cellularity. So we use certain specific terms when we are describing a renal biopsy, and these terms I will explain in a little more detail. Diffuse, when we say a lesion is diffuse, it means it's involving more than 50% of the glomeruli. Focal, when it involves less than 50%. A global lesion is one which is involving more than 50% of the glomerulus, the glomerular tuft. Segmental is when the lesion involves less than 50% of the glomerular tuft. Mesangial hypercellularity is defined as more than 3 mesangial cells per mesangial area in a 3 micron section. This is important because if you have a thicker section, you may have a pseudo increase in the mesangial hypercellularity. Endocapillary hypercellularity is defined as narrowing or occlusion of glomerular capillaries by endothelial cells, mesangial cells, and leukocytes. Extracapillary proliferation or crescent formation is defined as proliferation of more than 2 cell layers that involves more than 10% of the capsular circumference. Necrosis, any disruption of the GBM associated with presence of fibrin and karyorectic debris is considered necrosis of the glomerular tuft. So this is a lesion with global glomerular sclerosis. The various patterns that we may see in the biopsy, this is an ischemic type of glomerulosclerosis wherein the tuft is collapsed, stained with the PAS stain, and there is collagenization of the Bowman space. The tuft is shrunken and collapsed and sclerosed. Again, the same ischemic glomerulus in a silver stain showing the shrunken, collapsed tuft and collagenized Bowman space. Now, if we compare the two glomeruli here, this particular glomerulus has a large tuft which is globally sclerosed and solidified, and it is not shrunken. So this is the kind of appearance that we usually have in diabetes and in other chronic diseases which may lead to global glomerular solidification, such as amyloid, or even in the fibrillary glomerulopathies or immunotactoid, etc. This is a tuft with amyloid deposits in the glomerulus, which is again showing complete capillary luminal obliteration. So even by just looking at the morphology of a globally sclerosed glomerulus or a globally solidified tuft, we can get an idea of the specific renal pathology that we may be dealing with. These are lesions of the segmental tuft sclerosis. This is the classical tip lesion where there is sclerosis of the tubular pole with presence of an intracapillary foam cells, and the sclerosed tuft is prolapsing into the proximal tubule. There are prominent and hypertrophied overlying podocytes. This is the lesion usually classified as FSGS NOS, that is not otherwise specified. This is a FSGS perihilar area. As we see, this is a hilar arteriole, and this sclerosis involves the perihilar region, and hence it's perihilar FSGS. This glomerulus is showing collapse of the glomerular tuft with prominent overlying podocytes. This is the collapsing glomerulopathy, which is no longer considered to be a part of the FSGS spectrum and is considered to be a disease of its own. This is the endocapillary hypercellular cellularity observed in the glomerulus, showing there is complete obliteration of capillary lumens. We can hardly see any patent capillary lumina in either of these photomicrographs. The lumens are obliterated by leukocytes. We can see neutrophils, some lymphocytes and mononuclear cells, and endothelial cells, of course, which are swollen. This is extracapillary proliferation or crescent formation in a glomerulus. This is the tuft which has shrunken. And this is the capsular space or the bomal space, which is with extracapillary proliferation forming a complete crescent. Again, which is highlighting it beautifully. The tuft is staining black and it is shrunken, and there are multiple areas of disruption of the GBM. This is a PA stain, again a complete crescent. This is again a silver stain where the tuft has become a little more sclerotic and the crescent has become a little fibrous. So it's a fibrocellular crescent. This is an example of podocyte proliferation occurring in the extracapillary space, which can often be confused with crescents. And this is the shrunken, sclerosed capillary tuft. This is a case of collapsing glomerulopathy. These photomicrographs highlight mesangial proliferation and mesangial matrix expansion. We can see there are around 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, almost 8 mesangial nuclei in one mesangial area. So definitely a mesangial hypercellularity in the glomerulus. So mesangial cellularity should be assessed in the circumferential areas, in the peripheral areas of the tuft, rather than in the perihilar areas where you may have a false impression because of the arteriole. Again, a case of mesangial proliferation. Here there is more of matrix expansion and less of proliferation. We can see lesser number of nuclei. Does not fulfill the criteria for mesangial hypercellularity. This is classic mesangial matrix expansion, nodular matrix expansion, which occurs in diabetes mellitus, leading to formation of the classic Imelstein-Wilson lesions. Beautiful nodular glomerulosclerosis, highlighted by the PAS stain. These are PAS positive nodules. Positive nodules are gyrophilic, and this is an empty stain where they stain blue. Again, a case of mesangial matrix expansion by amyloid, nodule formation, Congo red stain, which classic birefringent staining on polarizing microscopy. Looking at the GBM here, it appears thickened. And if we see carefully, there are tiny spikes on the outer aspect. These are the epimembranous spikes that one sees in the classic membranous glomerulopathy. This is the silver stain of the GBM showing double contouring here. An empty stain of this particular case which showed presence of deposits. All these red are red staining areas are the subendothelial immune deposits. Again, another case of this was a transplant case where there was irregularity and double contouring of the GBM. Immunostaining patterns in the glomerulus. This is the linear staining pattern, classic linear bright staining pattern for IgG that we see in anti-GBM glomerulonephritis. If we see carefully, there's a crescent here which is occupying the space. This is the smudgy linear staining for IgG that we see in diabetes, which is not actually an antigen-antibody interaction. Rather, it is passive adsorption of the immunoglobulin onto the glomerular basement membrane. This is granular capillary wall and mesangial staining in a case of lupus nephritis. And this is a tubulointerstitial staining that we very often see in cases of lupus. So if we don't have the glomerulus in a biopsy and we see only this, in a case of suspected lupus, we can confidently give a diagnosis that yes, it's lupus nephritis. This is the granular staining that we see in a case of membranous glomerulopathy. This is mesangial staining pattern. All this stain here is in the mesangium, and there is no capillary wall staining at all. So this is a staining pattern that we usually see in IgA nephropathy. This is a starry sky pattern staining for C3, seen in infection-associated GN. Again, a garland pattern where there is granular capillary wall as well as mesangial staining, seen again in a case of infection-associated GNs. Tubulointerstitial lesions. The tubulointerstitium needs to be evaluated for resorption droplets in the tubular epithelium, for features of acute epithelial injury, presence of casts in the lumens, crystals, interstitial inflammation, and extent of tubular atrophy and interstitial fibrosis. This is the normal interstitium where there is hardly any interstitial space, and these are normal tubules. If we look here, the interstitium is expanded with edema and there are casts in the tubules. These are hyaline casts. Again, interstitial expansion by edema and inflammation. And this is presence of interstitial fibrosis, which stains intensely blue or green on empty, depending upon what counter stain we are using. This is a case of acute epithelial injury, acute tubular injury, where there is loss of tubular epithelial brush borders in the proximal tubules and there is sloughing of cytoplasm. Again, we can see here the tubular tubules appear dilated with a flattened lining. These are the sloughed tubular epithelial cells present within the lumens. This is infection-associated tubulointerstitial nephritis or pyelonephritis due to an ascending urinary tract infection, where you see neutrophilic abscesses and microabscesses in the biopsy with neutrophil casts and neutrophilic tubulitis. This is the case of acute tubulointerstitial nephritis, drug-induced, where we see eosinophils, the intense pink staining of the cytoplasm, the granules are stained. The interstitium shows marked edema. This is a case of a granuloma in the interstitium, most commonly drug-induced, but of course, other differential diagnoses of granulomas in the interstitium would include TB and sarcoidosis. This is a case of plasma cell-rich acute tubulointerstitial nephritis in a transplant kidney, where the tubular epithelium showed these classic intranuclear inclusions which stained for the SV40 antigen. Hence, it was a case of BKV nephropathy with plasma cell-rich interstitial nephritis. This is IgG4 related tubulointerstitial nephritis, where the interstitium is literally carpeted with inflammatory cells and accompanying fibrosis. There is a characteristic storiform pattern fibrosis or a pinwheel pattern fibrosis. This is the immunostaining for IgG and IgG4. This is interstitial expansion by amyloid deposits showing the characteristic birefringence. This is a case of myeloma cast nephropathy with intratubular casts. This is a PAS stain, so these casts are characteristically PAS negative. Sorry, this is a PAS stain, that was an HNE. This is a PAS stain, casts are negative, they show these fracture planes and there is an associated giant cell and histiocytic reaction. This is the DIF where the cast stained for lambda light chain with negative kappa and thus confirming light chain restriction. This was a case of light chain deposition disease with PS positive thickening of tubular basement membranes and beautifully picked up on the DIF where it stained positive for kappa and negative for lambda. This slide shows tissue ANA positivity, a feature which is not observed very often. There is nuclear staining in the tubulointerstitium for IgG. This is the nuclei. This is the glomerulus, which is staining so intensely, and these are the nuclei of the cells which are picking up the stain. Coming to vascular lesions, arteries need to be evaluated for intimal edema, fibrous thickening of the intima, endothelitis or vasculitis, which of course has more importance in the transplant setting, necrosis for deposits and for cholesterol crystals. Arterioles need to be looked at for hyalinosis, fibrin thrombi, fibrinoid necrosis of wall and deposits. This is a case of mild hypertension showing mild fibrous intimal thickening of the artery, while here it is relatively much more severe, causing luminal occlusion of the artery, near complete luminal occlusion. This is an arteriole, and these amorphous pink deposits are actually hyalinosis lesions, which again are seen in cases of long-standing benign hypertension. A case of malignant hypertension, where the artery is showing endothelial swelling, luminal occlusion, and edema along with some fibrosis. Complete luminal occlusion is there. This is the characteristic onion skinning of the artery caused by concentric intimal proliferation, also seen here in this photomicrograph. These are the findings that one would see in an acute thrombotic microangiopathy case. This is an arteriole which contains fibrin, and there are leukocytes along with it and some fragmented RBCs. Empty stain which is highlighting the fibrin. These are the changes in the glomerulus, where lumen would contain fibrin and fragmented RBCs, karyorectic. There is hardly any mesangium seen, so it is mesangiolytic. This is an empty stain showing red staining fibrin. This was a case of cholesterol crystal embolization in a patient who had recently undergone a coronary artery bypass. So these are cholesterol crystals which are there in the vessel wall with an associated giant cell reaction. It leads to acute renal failure in the patient. So to conclude, there are a few points to remember when one is reporting the renal biopsy. It's important to remember the kidney reacts to pathogenic influences in limited ways, hence histologic patterns of renal disease are very limited. The same pattern can be caused by different diseases, and the same disease can cause different histological patterns. So it is important to identify the histologic pattern and correlate with clinical and lab findings. And this is of utmost importance to arrive at the correct diagnosis. A dialogue with the nephrologist is an absolute must before you sign out the report. At Suburban Diagnosis, we have three diagnostics. We have three panels for the kidney biopsy. One is native kidney biopsy with DIF, one is the transplant kidney, and one is EM. These are kits that we specially designed for sample collection. So that brings me to the end of my talk. Any queries you may have, you can direct to this ID. And meanwhile, let's take questions. Dr. Vineet, I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Deepika, for that informative presentation. Before we just start with the Q&A, if you look at the top of the chat box, you'll now notice that a link will be shortly put up for the certificates. Please fill in the forms to receive your certificate within 7 working days. We'll now just move on to the Q&A session. So we have received a few questions. My first question is directed to Dr. Shah. One clinician has asked, how important is asymptomatic proteinuria? What should be the approach from the perspective of a general practitioner?
So once you see patients who has got no symptoms and urine routine shows proteinuria, then you check on 3 occasions at 15 days interval and see whether the proteinuria remains same trace 1+ or 2+. If it is 1+ or 2+, you do your urine protein creatinine ratio or 24 hours urine protein collection, which is little tedious. Now, if 24 hours urine protein or protein creatinine ratio is more than 300 milligram, then this patient has either a glomerular or a tubular dysfunction. And if he has hypertension or decrease in GFR, and if kidney size is normal, the patient is very worried that what next and what is going on in the kidney. You do your immunological markers if they are negative to satisfy the diagnosis, final stamp on the proteinuria. You may do the kidney biopsy and label the disease. A small proteinuria of 300, 500 up to 1000 milligram, if there are no associated diabetes, blood pressure, or any immunological disease, we just treat with either ACE or ARB. But if there is some ANA positivity or CNCA, PNCA, or hypertension or other thing, then we treat them aggressively. So a proteinuria in an asymptomatic patient with no other complaints must be observed for 1 or 2 months. It has to be followed with 24 hours urine protein collection. And if it is more than 300 milligram, and the patient is very keen to know why protein is going leaking, then you may do kidney biopsy.
Thank you, sir. One question for Dr. Ratika is, any other findings other than fibrosis in the kidney in a patient with IgG4 syndrome?
Yeah, plasma cells would be there, plasma cells and accompanying lymphocytes, but yeah, plasma cells are important, and then we need to demonstrate the IgG staining, evaluate for serum IgG4 levels.
So on microscopy, any other findings other than fibrosis is what the question is.
Plasma cells,
Plasma cell.
plasma cell rich inflammation.
Plasma cell. Will obliterative thrombophlebitis be seen in the kidney in the IgG4?
Yeah, you can.
But it's not your first line look. That's not the first thing that you look for.
No, it's not.
Okay, thank you, sir. To Dr. Shah, one query that has come is: are the newer COVID drugs safe for CKD patients?
Most of the drugs except favipiravir, where they don't give you exact dosing, but they say that once creatinine is high or creatinine clearance is low, then you reduce the dose of favipiravir. But remdesivir, both in renal dysfunction and CKD, they said that if the benefit outweighs side effect, you should give it to the patient. Remdesivir, they are not suggesting any dose modification, but favipiravir, yes.
Okay, so it's at the end of the day, it's a risk-benefit ratio assessment.
Yes.
Yes.
And all these drugs are not yet proved to be a great drugs. They have just reduced the hospital stay of the patient. From 15 days to 11 days, the patients were recovered. But there's no sudden change in markers or other things. So people are using it, but still nobody has shown actual benefit of the drugs.
Okay, thank you, sir. To Dr. Ratika and to Dr. Arun Shah, this is a question I think that both of you can answer. Is if IgA nephropathy is detected in one individual with a person in the previous generation having a history of a similar illness, is it indicated to genetically screen the rest of the family?
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
any family history in kidney diseases has to be genetically evaluated.
So what are the modalities available for a clinician in India right now for this?
No, not really, nothing much.
Tests are outsourced to the US.
So it would have to go through a lab to the US.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. I think we have time for one last question. So a question that's been asked a couple of times during today's webinar is to Dr. Shah. What is the protocol for a person who is experiencing chronic UTI?
Yeah. So now chronic UTI, according to me, there are two aspects to it. Whether it is symptomatic or asymptomatic. It's just the presence of pus in the urine or a symptomatic patient. Now, first I will take the just presence of pus in the urine. There are so many postmenopausal women, around 60 and more, diabetics, where the patient will keep on coming back to you with 40, 50, 60, 80 pus cells. Now, this particular patient, if they have no symptoms, if nitrites are negative, leukocyte esterase is negative, I don't treat the patient. But always do a sonography to see whether this patient has any post-void residue and rule out the fungal infections, the white discharge, because postmenopausal females are likely to develop vaginitis, and secondary to that, they keep on developing small infections or WBCs in the urine. But asymptomatic diabetic pyurias, we don't treat. Symptomatic chronic infections will always have nitrite positive or leukocyte esterase positive, or the culture will come positive. Now, if a patient is symptomatic and if the culture is positive, then you have to treat the patient as per the culture report in chronic thing. And subsequently, once you have treated for 7 to 10 days or 15 days with acute medication, they should be followed with some small either Septran or Norflox or nitrofurantoin for a long term, maybe 2 or 3 months, sometimes up to 6 months. Now, patients who have some obstructive element where they retain urine in the bladder, they will keep on coming back with recurrent infection. And normally they come back with infections after sexual this thing. So we train them to clean their vaginal area, take a treatment for white discharge. We also treat the husband and try to take care of the patient. 8 out of 10 times you are successful in treating the patient and keep them off second infection for a year or two. But 2 out of 10, they remain resistant. They keep on coming back with dysuria, frequency, pain, and occasional fever. These are the patient may require recurrent courses of good antibiotics as per culture. But experience is that there is some reason to it. It is either the retention, using a bad glue, or not following good hygienic precautions, and they are the cause of chronic infection. If you are diabetic, if you are obstructive, or if you have a stone, in those cases you have to treat the primary condition, and the infection will get controlled.
Thank you, sir. I was actually planning that to be the last question, but we have gotten 2 more questions which are very topical, so I'll just ask that out. This is to Dr. Shah. Are there any COVID-related complications in the kidney that practitioners looking after COVID patients should be on the lookout for?
In fact, we had a series of lectures from Italy, France, Portugal, and US, New York, in the month of April and early May, where they showed that 30% of patients admitted in ICU with COVID had AKI, and almost 8 to 10% of them they required renal replacement therapy. So incidence of acute kidney injury was very high, and in the post-mortem biopsies in Italy, they have shown virus particles in the kidney biopsy. So it is almost 30% involvement.
So the index of suspicion should be high, and we should be on the lookout for it. Yes.
Yeah. In fact, all patients are seen by nephrologists in ICU for their electrolyte imbalance, intake, output, drug modifications, and antibiotic dosing. The issue is hydration, whether to hydrate, overhydrate, or underhydrate, whether to give diuretics, not give diuretics. So it's a very fine balance in patient of COVID with secondary sepsis in ICU.
Thank you, sir. I think what we can understand from that is any treatment of COVID will have to be a multidisciplinary one with multiple teams of doctors being in, rather than just one doctor of one specialty treating the treatment. That's all the time we have for now. I would like to thank the speakers for their phenomenal sessions and all the attendees for joining us today and for their interesting questions. We will email you a link to the recording of this webinar within 24 to 48 hours. You'll be able to watch the webinar at your convenience. Please feel free to forward the link to your colleagues who may have missed today's session. Till we meet again for another webinar, stay safe. Thank you, Dr. Ratika. Thank you, Dr. Arun Shah.
Thank you, Vinit. Thank you. We can sign out.
Yes, sir.